Hi everybody, it's Mr. Drake. This video will go through the highlights of the presidency of John F. Kennedy. He served for approximately 1,000 days from his inauguration in 1961 to his assassination around Thanksgiving in 1963. We're going to go through some domestic stuff and a little bit about foreign policy, and then a brief little bit about the assassination itself and its legacy and the legacy of Kennedy itself. So with that, let's get started. JFK is not up from nothing. He was born and raised incredibly wealthy in a fairly well-to-do family. He was the second of 9 children born to Joseph P. and Rose Kennedy. Joe Kennedy Sr. was the ambassador to the United Kingdom in the 1930s. He was actually one of the architects of the Munich Conference, which of course was the disastrous conference where the future allies basically appeased Hitler and allowed him to take over half of Czechoslovakia. He served in World War II, received a lot of commendations for his heroic actions there. He was commanding a naval patrol boat in the Pacific. It was rammed by the Japanese and essentially sank. He rescued a lot of the members of his crew and got them to safety, where they were eventually rescued, and he received a lot of accolades for that. His oldest brother, Joe Kennedy Jr., was actually killed in World War II in 1944. He got back from the war in 1946. He was elected to Congress at the age of 29. That was a year that Republicans had done relatively well, so it was impressive that a Democrat was able to win there. And then in 1952, he got elected to the open Senate seat in Massachusetts, was reelected to that in 1958, and from there was seen as almost immediately a front runner for the presidential election in 1960. Kennedy got nominated in 1960 by the Democratic Party. He fended off a late challenge by the Senate Majority Leader, Texas Senator Lyndon Johnson. They basically worked out their differences at the convention, and JFK decided to make Lyndon Johnson his running mate. They didn't particularly like each other or get along, but after Kennedy's death, Johnson did try to push a lot of Kennedy's policies through, especially when it came to civil rights. The 1960 election was important because it's where you begin to see TV take a bigger and bigger role in presidential politics. If you're in my class, you know, we watched some examples of television ads from 52 and 56 with Eisenhower, but 1960 is notable for being the first televised presidential debates, which Kennedy and his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, had several of in the fall of 1960. And there actually wouldn't be any more debates until 1976, when the League of Women Voters started doing those. The apocryphal story is that people who listened on the radio thought the debates were a draw, or that maybe Nixon had done a little bit better, but people on TV thought that Kennedy had done well because he looked good, and he looked cool, calm, and collected, and charismatic, and all of that, and Nixon was Nixon. You know, he was sweaty and sort of shifty and didn't appear as trustworthy. Again, there's really no hard polling data to back that up, but that's kind of how the story goes from people who kind of remember that time. You do have a lot of campaign advertisements during that campaign as well on both sides. Kennedy's religion played a role in the campaign. He was the first Catholic to be president, and there hadn't been many to run for president either. Al Smith did in 1928 when he lost to Hoover, and you know, Kennedy kind of faced it head on and said, "Yeah, I'm Catholic. I'm not going to let that, you know, color what I do as president. It doesn't define me." And in the end, it didn't end up hurting him much. You can see he won a lot of the southern states anyway, like most Democrats would at the time, right? Nixon ran on the fact that he was more experienced in federal office, had been vice president for 2 terms. He was a little bit older than Kennedy, but not by much. You know, Kennedy was 43 and Nixon was 47, 48. So either way, America was going to get a young president with small kids in 1960, which was kind of neat. And the election was pretty close nationally, but in the electoral vote, Kennedy was up over 300. And he won a lot of the big ticket states there, like Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York, and of course he swept most of the South. But it did take until about 7 or 8 the next morning until NBC called the election for Kennedy. I remember they called it on the Today Show. Actually, I've seen footage of that. I don't remember it. I wasn't there, but it wasn't for several hours after the polls closed, you know, well into the next day, that they were able to determine that JFK had won a squeaker there. Kennedy's package of policies became collectively known as the New Frontier, which was a term that was derived from his speech that he gave at the 1960 Democratic Convention, where he referred to the 1960s as a new frontier on which America was about to embark. And in many ways, this election was seen as sort of a passing of the torch. He was the first president born in the 20th century. He was born in 1917. He was one of the youngest presidents ever. He was the youngest ever president elected at the age of 43. Teddy Roosevelt was 42, and he became president upon McKinley's assassination. And in that way, it's sort of similar to Bill Clinton's election in 1992, being the first baby boomer president, kind of that, moving the presidency and the seat of power from one generation to the next, right? In his inaugural address, he appealed to a common purpose and sort of the sense of idealism and call to service for people. The most famous quote from his inaugural address: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And the New Frontier provided a lot of opportunities for people to, do things to make the country and the world a better place. And so, Kennedy was seen as someone who was sort of able to rally people to that cause. And there, in addition to domestic stuff, there were some foreign policy components of the New Frontier too, where America wanted to extend these ideals and virtues of democracy and cooperation and stuff, not only within the United States but also around the world. So we'll take a look now at what some of those policies were in the New Frontier. One of the first big things that JFK did was work to reduce taxes. Tax rates had remained very, very high during World War II and never really went down in the years after the war. So some of those really high tax rates that had been put in place to help fund the war effort just sort of stayed in place. And so, fearing that eventually the economy was going to slow down, JFK didn't want high taxes to be a drag on the economy, so they worked to reduce personal and corporate income tax rates in the early 1960s. He increased the funding for low-income housing that had been allocated by Truman and Eisenhower, especially in large cities. The minimum wage went up to $1.25 an hour, which relative to inflation is one of the highest minimum wages we've ever had in the United States. More federal funding for mental health facilities, trying to take some of the stigma off of mental health problems that people had in the country. Looking at gender-based discrimination, JFK passed the Equal Pay Act in 1963, which said that women should not be discriminated against on the basis of their gender when it came to being given pay, equal pay for equal work. And of course, that is not even the case now, that women, still don't make as much as men do for the same job, but it has gotten a lot better since 1963. It was about 60 cents on the dollar, I think, that women made relative to men at that time, and now it's closer to 80. So it did improve as a result of the Equal Pay Act, even if it's not all the way there. There was also something put together called the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women that was actually chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt when it was put together in 1961, and she chaired that until she died in 1962, I believe. And it investigated ways in which women had been discriminated against, especially in the workplace. It set up a way for women to receive back pay if they could prove that they were discriminated against, and so a lot of money was actually given to women to redress that, again, if they were able to prove it. When it came to civil rights, JFK had a lot of ideas, and he was very much in favor of civil rights, but he was not able to get a lot done during his presidency. The Civil Rights Act that passed in 1964 under Lyndon Johnson was Kennedy's brainchild in some ways, but he was unable to actually get it passed. A lot of what JFK did with regards to civil rights during his presidency were sort of incremental steps, similar to what you'd seen FDR and Truman make in the 1940s. Executive orders saying you couldn't discriminate in federally funded public housing, for instance, when renting out homes or stuff like that. So little baby steps, but civil rights progress would primarily come during Johnson's presidency in the later part of the 60s. Some foreign policy aspects of the New Frontier. One would be the Peace Corps. which still exists today. You've probably heard of it. It sends American youth around the world for various purposes. A lot of Peace Corps volunteers are teachers in third world countries like Africa and in Latin America. Sometimes they're scientists and engineers working on public health issues like eradication of malaria and stuff like that as well. There's a bit of a Cold War ulterior motive to the Peace Corps. The idea was that if America sent its best and brightest around the world as goodwill ambassadors of sorts, that those countries or people in those countries would start to look more favorably upon the United States and maybe be less receptive to overtones from the Soviet Union or other communist countries, right? The Alliance for Progress was a little closer to home. It was an organization intended to promote economic cooperation between the U.S. and Latin American countries. This usually consisted of America investing money in businesses in those countries and trying to stabilize some of those countries that were politically a little bit volatile. The success of that is somewhat mixed. A lot of Latin American countries ended up with military dictatorships in the 1960s and 70s, like Argentina and Chile. So, a bit of a mixed bag on that one. Extremely foreign policy, leaving the planet, in fact. Kennedy was a big fan of the space program, and in 1961 decided to give the space program a mission, and that was to land an American on the moon by the end of the decade, before the end of 1969, which was seen as being virtually impossible to achieve. The space program already existed. America had put some people into space, but America also seemed very behind the Soviet Union when it came to the space race, as it became known. The Soviets were the first to put a person in space. They were the first people to orbit the Earth. They were the first spacewalkers to leave the vehicle in orbit, and it wasn't seen as very likely, but when Kennedy died in 1963, it was seen as a way to honor his legacy or his memory, was to actually achieve that goal. And America, to their credit, landed 2 missions on the moon by the end of 1969. Apollo 11 with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed in July of 1969, and then Apollo 12 landed in November of that year. In terms of other foreign policy, Kennedy's presidency was sort of the low point of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is the closest America ever came to nuclear war, basically, and there were 2 events during Kennedy's presidency that marked that. The first is the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro becomes the leader of Cuba in 1959, and Cuba immediately starts accepting aid from the Soviet Union and sort of become a Soviet puppet state of sorts. And almost immediately, the United States starts trying to come up with ways to get rid of Castro. Political assassinations, you name it. So one of the plans they settled upon with the CIA was they would train Cuban exiles, people who had left Cuba and fled to the United States after Castro came to power. And they would use those exiles, after they trained them up, to invade Cuba and remove Castro from power. It didn't work. It was signed off on by Eisenhower basically on the way out the door in 1960. It happened under Kennedy's watch, so he accepted responsibility for it, even though he's not the one who planned it out. But it was just a mess. A lot of those exiles who landed in Cuba ended up being captured or killed. America was supposed to support them militarily with airstrikes and stuff, which they did end up doing. So Kennedy took the fall for this, and it was kind of considered the low mark of his presidency. The most famous example of America-Soviet relations being bad during this time that you're probably the most familiar with is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in October of 1962. America was doing spy plane missions over Cuba with U-2 spy planes, and they found photographic evidence of offensive nuclear missiles being put in Cuba, essentially pointed at the United States. And those missiles could have hit any American city except for Seattle. They would have only had a few minutes of warning, and these were not defensive weapons like the Cubans and the Soviets initially claimed. Like, these were, huge honking missiles that were supposed to provide like a first strike capability against the United States. So initially, America's military top brass wanted to just invade Cuba, wanted to do airstrikes, doing it basically an invasion and all of that, and kind of prepared for that. And Kennedy said, no, we know where that would go in the end if we went that route. So what they decided to do was blockade Cuba and stop any more missiles from getting there. A blockade is technically an act of war, so they called it a quarantine of Cuba. And the Soviets decided not to run the blockade. They turned their ships around and went back to the Soviet Union, or at least retreated away from Cuba. After that, the U.S. and Cuba began, or the U.S. and the Soviets, began negotiating an end to this. The U.S. could not allow the missiles to remain. They made that very clear. The deal that ended up being struck that ended this threat of nuclear annihilation was the Soviet Union would remove their missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States would take their missiles out of Turkey, which had been there going back to like 1940s when the Truman Doctrine was established essentially to protect Greece and Turkey from Soviet aggression. And the U.S. also had to pledge to never invade Cuba or help anyone else do so, which was fine by Kennedy. Kennedy said, basically it was never his intention to invade Cuba anyway until the missiles were put there. So that's why America never actually invaded Cuba during Castro's term as the leader of that country, even though America could have easily taken him out at any time. But they had pledged not to do so in 1962. So that'll do it for this video. If you're one of my students, I'll also add some resources online about the assassination of Kennedy and some stuff about his legacy that I'd encourage you to give a look at as well. If you have any questions, post them in the comments. But otherwise, we'll see you soon. Cheers.